welcome to the 7th episode of The Right Cost. Now, we are back in the controversy. We are back into it because we cannot stay away. And there is no escaping the controversy in 2023 because that's all anything ever becomes, mostly. And we're going to talk about that because it came to my attention today, just now, for this episode, that even a certain game, another game, has been controversial. I mean, we were talking about Hogwarts Legacy before, and we all know about how controversial that's been. But it seems no gamers are unable to escape controversy. And whilst that's not going to be the sole focus of the discussion for this episode, I do think pointing out some of the controversies surrounding things that are relevant and current, like Final Fantasy 16, would be good as an anchor point and may get some of you who care about that a bit more interested in the conversation and just kind of understand and have a frame of reference for why we're discussing this and why even still today it's relevant, because some people could be like, oh, well, no one cares about that stuff anymore. Oh, that's not a big deal. But no, it's a continuing discussion, the discussion between, as you can see in the title, cultural appropriation versus cultural appreciation, right? Obviously, a lot of people have their different views on what is considered appropriation and what's considered appreciation, and where the line is drawn is very, very random. And I'm going to tell you right now, based on stuff I've seen over the years, everyone makes up their own line. Okay, I can spoilers. That's pretty much the answer as far as I know it. Everyone makes their own line and just decides this is what I think is appropriation. And you know, you'll realize this when you engage with conversation with people and you ask them. But anyway, that's pretty much the topic for the episode. We're gonna just unpack this and discuss it. Anthony, it was you who suggested this topic, and so what exactly about this topic, you know, what was it that made you want to discuss it? Why was you drawn to this specific discussion?
Yeah, so to give some background, I mentioned in the very first episode that Final Fantasy 16 was one of the most interesting projects that was coming out this year that I eventually wanted to discuss. I never actually imagined that this would be the reason why we would be discussing that game. But this game has seen controversy after controversy ever since it was first announced a couple of years ago. The initial reason why it came under attack was the announcement that it was only going to be coming out for the PlayStation 5. That rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. And I actually think that's part of the reason why people keep going after it again and again, is because you have a certain segment of the audience that's looking for any excuse to go after that game.
Yeah.
But the biggest controversy about the game is that the Final Fantasy series has always been a series where it is a Japanese development team who are making a Dungeons and Dragons, Lord of the Rings, very European fantasy style series. And so this has taken many forms. With Final Fantasy 7, you end up having actually a very sci-fi heavy base game. With Final Fantasy 10, you actually turn into a more Polynesian-centered fantasy. But throughout the series, it's been representing various cultures. And so with Final Fantasy 16, they did the latest round of previews, and the controversy has come up once again about how you have a Japanese team that are trying to tackle cultures from around the world in their project. And so during that discussion, it also came up that this is a Japanese team trying to make what they're considering a RPG, just a normal video game, but they're being pigeonholed into what has been commonly referred to as a JRPG, a Japanese role-playing game. And so because they are a Japanese team making a role-playing game, there are certain boxes that they have to cross off. It has to be a game with a spiky-haired protagonist. It has to be a teenage protagonist. It has to be about saving the world. It has to be about defeating an evil monster and trying to change fate and all that. And so this is kind of what inspired me to bring this up, in that I'm interested to hear kind of more of your thoughts about how do we address different cultures in storytelling, and the line of when do we borrow from cultures? How do we do it respectfully? When is it crossing the line? And how do we avoid getting pigeonholed when depicting certain cultures? So broad topic.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, and this is, I'm just gonna play some of the footage here, so we can have something to have in the background. But yeah, this is one of the things that, like, I mean, you know, we're always going to have these discussions and these different kinds of debates about things like this because, again, like, people, especially in this day and age, there's a lot of things people want to kind of address and talk about that I guess maybe we haven't thought about all the time or stuff like that. Like, again, it only came to my attention today, this entire discussion and argument around the term JRPGs. I had no idea until today, which I guess shows just how out of the loop I am with that. But I didn't know about that. And I find that a very, very interesting discussion in and of itself because in a lot of ways, I do understand why the developers would feel some type of way about that specific label and classification of their work, because especially if they don't use it themselves. If from your perspective it's an RPG, I mean, like, for example, it's like if I make a novel and then they decide to put that under black fantasy fiction, it's like, why can't it just be fantasy fiction? Like, now I guess if I'm calling it that, then that's one thing. But for other people to classify it as that when I didn't, um, it kind of is a bit like, where's that coming from? Then, of course, if the history that kind of ties to that is a bit where there's been sometimes some animosity towards, Japanese made games, or people, questioning their quality, and, are they even as serious as games like Mass Effect and Dragon Age and blah, 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 like Western RPGs, as people would call them, which I guess is a fair point as also to say, to counter, is that, like, there are people who will call, sometimes in discussions like this, they will say WRPG or Western RPG. But it's, again, it depends. Like, I don't know. I can see why people would feel bothered about it, but in terms of the general thread of just the general topic about cultural appropriation, anyway, I think, again, a lot of people want to see representation, like we was talking about in the diversity episode. They want to see all these things, but, and this is why one of the main things I kept banging on about in that episode was, do it yourself, like, make the representation yourself, or support the things that you care about that have those things in them. It's because if you if you constantly keep trying to go to other people and say, put the representation and put this in there, put this in there, put this in there, why? I mean, at the end of the day, right, if the developers are from one culture, it should be assumed they will probably represent their culture. Now, this is why it's always interesting with Japanese developers, because a lot of the time they actually are some of, I would say, they probably go out there a lot more than you'd think, especially with what their culture is like, and with the fact that they're so homogenous within their own society, and that typically, like, most of the people they know, Japanese people. You know what I mean? It's mostly just, it's not like here, or like here where I live in London, where there's tons of different people and stuff like that. Not to say, obviously, there's foreigners and other people who live there, but in terms of, like, the scale that we have here in the West, and in terms of how much value we place on it, they definitely, and a lot of people who've gone and lived in Japan and found out real quick they don't place as much value on that as much as we do. So I guess, without sounding like I'm going too far off the topic, I'm really just trying to get to the idea that there's different cultural sentiments and values already. And so for them to make some form of effort, I feel, in my view, I would say that should be something that is seen as appreciation, especially in regards to Japanese developers specifically, considering how much people in the West, like, overly romanticize Japanese media and and basically, in a sense, simplify Japanese culture for the sake of having an aesthetic, right? And I mean, people do it all the time. You got, like, I actually know there's actually a girl I know she's Korean, and she actually, I don't know if this is an actual term. I've never looked up. I don't know, but she says it's like Orientalism. Whenever, like, for example, I was showing her, like things in cyberpunk, and how in a lot of cyberpunk settings they'll have, like, like Chinese or Japanese characters, usually I think Japanese characters, and she was saying that it's like, well, they just take that imagery and the language, and they just put it there, like, oh, it's cool now, right? And let's be honest, that is a lot of part of why it's there. Let's not lie to ourselves. It does look cool. I don't, but then, is us thinking it looks cool and then putting that in a cyberpunk setting, is that bad? Because in a lot of ways, what you're doing is appreciating the fact you think it looks cool, right? I don't know. It's a very interesting one, because some people view it as like, well, yeah, but do you actually understand what it is? And I think that's a lot of the time where people are drawing the line. at least most commonly, I would say that's the most sensible place I've seen people drawing the line is, well, how much do you actually know about the culture that you're borrowing from versus are you just using it because of some superficial reasoning, right? But I don't know. Does it matter? What would you say to Anthony? Do you think it really matters whether people use it for superficial reasoning or not?
I mean, it's so tricky to say where it's like, it goes back to that debate where people want more representation, but people are also going to complain about how you use representation if it isn't in the way that you want. Where something that comes to mind is the double standard, where I'm a huge fan of Avatar: The Last Airbender, which is a American-made cartoon series with very clear Eastern anime influence in terms of its world design, in terms of its characters, even in the way that it looks. So everyone praised that when it came out as a children's cartoon. But when M. Night Shyamalan made it into a live action movie, I remember that he got hit hard for some of the ways that he depicted cultures in that movie. And so part of it is a quality thing where the TV show was great and the movie was absolute garbage. But it's even tricky where this discussion came up again when I went to see Avatar: The Way of Water a few months ago, where the water tribe of the Na'vi are very, very clearly inspired by Polynesian cultures, as opposed to the air tribes, which are very clearly inspired by Native American cultures. And a lot of people liked it, but a lot of people felt like the representation was bad, that maybe James Cameron shouldn't have borrowed from Polynesian cultures when he was making his Alien Species. And to me, that's kind of absurd. It's an alien species that he was making up. I think you can borrow from human cultures to make an alien species, but I'm also not technically Polynesian. And I know that the person who was complaining about the Polynesian culture was also a white person. But it is just an interesting debate where I don't know if there's a clear line on when it's appreciation versus appropriation, other than people tend to complain a lot more when the work is bad. If the storytelling is bad, people have a lot more reason to complain about it.
Yeah, it's always going to be like that because then their emotions towards it are already negative, so then they're going to look for any other little thing that they can add to justify why they didn't like it. Yeah, I think that there's a lot of like, I think honestly, I personally think a lot of it is just people just looking for an excuse to be mad about something. Because if I'm going to be honest with you, there's so much aspects of it that's hypocritical. I don't know many people who can actually honestly have a criticism about it and not in some way be in some area of their life doing the same thing. It's very, very unlikely because you can literally start extending that to anything. Then you can start saying that, well, if you live in this country and you dress like this, or if you wear this, like for example, you got people who will complain about cultural appropriation, but then they love wearing things like kimonos and stuff. Do they know what that is or what it means? Probably
I read
not.
articles where it's like it's cultural appropriation if you cook cuisine from other countries.
Well, there you go. Like you've got, and it's like, okay, but like, okay, let's like actually just really, so let's say it is, right? Let's say it is cultural appropriation to do XYZ. Now what? Like, I mean, that's just how I view it. Like, okay, let's say you're right and you made your point. Cool. Now what? I mean, is the argument just, well, stop doing it? Okay. So let's take all those, because here's the thing. That basically means the only people who should ever be making anything about any culture is basically only the people who are from that culture. Now, I am going to say this. I do understand the need for that. And I'm going to be honest with you. I think that when it comes to certain discussions, the people who are more from a certain culture, it makes sense to probably listen more to what they view it like and how they see it than other people, right? Especially because, if just being honest, there is a history of other people always trying to tell certain people what they should think, or like, I can definitely say, and that's why it's funny you brought up like about how it might be like another white person saying it or whatever, because I've noticed that there are some people where they feel like it's almost their duty. It's a lot of people say it, the white savior trope, and it is a real thing. I'm sorry, it is, and it is annoying as hell. Like it is the most because it's just like it's so insulting, and I get it in that regard. I do get it, and I have seen that, and I understand that there are sometimes where, but that's actually on the side of the people who argue cultural. That's like me going against that, because there's a lot of those white people be like, oh, those poor people from that culture, you can't take their things, and it's like, no, like let them say that if that's how they really feel. Why are you stepping in like as if you know what I mean? Like, it's not your place. Just relax. Now, if those people make some commentary and you empathize and you support them, okay, fair enough. But why do you need to be the flag bearer? It doesn't make sense, because you shouldn't be the face of something that you're not, because that in and of itself is you. It just doesn't make sense to me. Like cultural appropriation, but let me be, loud and proud about the fact that this, like, why don't you instead just push up the people who are from that culture that are making noise about it, if they are? And that's another thing, because a lot of times they ain't. This actually reminds me of when Ghost in the Shell had this adaptation ages ago, and a lot of people were getting mad about the casting and saying, oh, this isn't right. And I'm going to be honest with you. Look, I personally would prefer if they, just because of the simple fact that I just think it would be interesting just to maybe watch. Like, yeah, it'd be cool if maybe they did just keep it more in that type of, like, just if it's set in Japan. Like, it's like, for example, when I watch anime, if I'm watching an anime and it's set in Japan, I will refuse to watch it in a dub, just because I'm just trying to, I just feel like it's part of the immersion. It's like, well, in that setting, they would not be talking English, would they? So why am I listening to it? That's just how I watch it. You don't have to watch it like that. I'm not going to get mad at someone if they don't watch it like that. But I just think that it's little things like that where, for me personally, that's like my version, like there's an immersive element to it. So if something's set in Japan, and if canonically it's mostly, in Ghost in the Shell it wasn't exactly like that, but like, let's just say in other things, like for example, you brought up The Last Airbender, like a lot of people's issue where they was getting mad at the fact of the casting, again, where I understand with that film, where people were kind of like, well, the characters blatantly don't look like this, and they're blatantly not, this character's white and they're blatantly not white. Yeah, I mean, I'm not gonna lie to you, that's a bit like, did you look at the characters, bro? Like, I mean, they don't look like, and again, people say, well, it shouldn't matter, and it's like, well, I don't know, because like what you said, if it's so blatantly Eastern inspired, and the thing I don't get is, like, if the show was popular as it was, why don't you just do that then? Like, like, why can't you just take that? People clearly did not care about the people, certain people's skin colors being darker, so you can just do that, right? But yeah, go on.
Yeah, so the one interesting counter argument with that, and this is where I do kind of waffle back and forth, where I don't know what to think, is that you do have to think about marketability a bit. You do have to think about, what can I do to make people interested in my project? And this is the reason why Chris Pratt is voicing Mario. Yes, he's not your traditional Italian American that you would have to voice him, but you need a big name attached to the project in order to get people interested. Something that me and my dad have gone back and forth is that Sony announced they're making a Ghosts of Tsushima movie. That is Ghost of Tsushima is a video game about the Mongolian invasion of Japan. And so there's not a single white person in that story. Me and him have debated, is that really going to do well? Because if they try to make a big Hollywood movie out of it, you can't have a single white person attached to that project. So how are you going to market it? So that is where just to finish my point, that is where I kind of understand why sometimes you do have to appropriate culture a little bit and make some changes. Because at the end of the day, the mainstream audience is not going to show up unless you can include some of the big star names. Now, there are exceptions to this. There are definitely cases where you can take a fully international, fully non-white American thing and make it into a big successful project. But you are gambling the dice, and you are, from a financial standpoint, taking a bigger risk on it. And so I can see why the pencil pushers, the accountants, would be like, we need you to shove some more white people in this.
But then this is the thing. Then why make it then? If it's like if you like, why bother? Why make a story that's set in Japan, about the Mongol? Like what is going through your brain when you look at that and say, oh, that would be cool, but it hasn't got enough white people? Then maybe you just shouldn't touch it. Then maybe you should just go make a story about white people. Like, I don't get it. It doesn't make sense to me. Why even waste the time? Because I'm not gonna lie, that does sound more like we want to poach something from somewhere and then whitewash it. Like, it does sound like that, because that is quite literally what it is. Like, because to me as a creator, like, I would just think I will just make something. And the thing is about it is that there's so much stuff that is original ideas or IP or whatever, and so you don't have to adapt things all the time. This is another issue of this trend of like, let's remake this, let's adapt this, let's blah blah blah, and that's cool, but you know, because this is the thing. You've got the other thing, like what we're talking about, the diversity thing, where now they're trying to always put something diverse everywhere and in everything. And so it's kind of funny because that doesn't seem to bother them in marketability. Like, even though people will blatantly tell them don't do it, and they'll still do it. So I mean, I don't know. That at this point in this day and age, it doesn't seem like they really care. Like it's funny because if that's bothering them that much, there's a lot of things they shouldn't be doing right now. And personally, I would think that that's the last thing. I mean, you look at things like Squid Game, did fine. Most people didn't even watch it in English, and I really hope you didn't watch it in English. I really hope you didn't. Like, you know, and that's a big deal, because I'll tell you what happened with that in particular. When Squid Game was out, I was one of those people. I was like, I'm not watching it because, you know, just being a hipster, like everyone wouldn't shut up. So I'm like, I'm not watching it. And then my mum came to me and she was like, if you watch this Squid Game, whatever, and I was like, my mum's bringing this up. Interesting. Because my mum is the type of person, she watches different kinds of things, but she typically will not sit down and watch something where she has to read subtitles. So one of the reasons why I've always struggled to get her into like anime, for example. So even though you can watch a lot of dubbed anime, but like some animes are just like, if it was like when I would put it on with subs, she'd be like, no. But yeah, like, it's very interesting because that show, basically the only real way of watching it is with with the subs. The dub is basically just like if you wanted to have a parody version and laugh. And yet look at how big of a deal it was, right? Another Korean thing was Parasite. That was a big deal. I mean, that literally, I believe, won an Oscar, right?
I believe it won Best Picture the year it came out.
Yeah. So, and I mean, and I think there was a big deal because of the first movie that was like non-English and like a fully foreign film, I think, to actually pull that off. And so that's the reason why, like, see, if everyone has the mentality all the time of like, well, we can't make something because this is like what the argument always was against making like a black fantasy or any type of thing that had different types of people, is like, oh, well, it won't sell. But the truth of the matter is that like, there's a sizable enough portion of people who care about certain things that will back certain things. I mean, like, for example, again, like the examples I used, but also with Black Panther, it was like, okay, well, this was a film with mostly black people in it. Now, they did still have white people in it, but the film was mostly being driven and pushed by black characters. And yet it made over $1 billion. Now, let's be real, it was also attached to the MCU, which is, you know, not a black thing. So that kind of has to be noted as well. It's not like it was in isolation. But you have, like, I just think it's worth pointing out, because I do agree, and I do think, yeah, pragmatically, you do need to think about marketability. And I'm not really mad at people for thinking about marketability, but I'm more kind of just thinking, well, why is it that you don't, if marketability is that big of a deal to you, why don't you just start with that and then just only do things that already aligns with it? Why go into something that doesn't align with it and then force the change? Because that's the exact reason why people are arguing against diversity. Because they're like, well, you're just forcing it in. It's like, well, the same with the other side, because it's the same thing. It's just white. It's white diversity, basically. It's the same thing, right? It's like you're forcing it in. For what reason? Just leave the story as it is. And if that doesn't work, or you feel like it won't be marketed, I don't know, just don't make it then. That's what most people do. If you go to like a publisher and you've got a book and they feel like they can't put it on the shelf, they just won't take it, right? They're not going to be like, we'll take this and let's find a way to force things to make it marketable, when they could just get a story that's already marketable. What's the point? It doesn't make any sense. I at least I don't personally get it. I think that it's, yeah, I just think it's nonsensical. I would rather not do like just see people just make original things that fit. And also, again, I think it's not even entirely accurate because there's things that come out and prove, like people will sit down and watch things. And I'm going to be completely honest, and this is actually a credit because even though everyone with these conversations about diversity, cultural appropriation, let's be honest, it's usually white people who are getting attacked for these things. Even though that's completely unfair because it's not, you know, I understand to an extent, but I don't know. Like, look, I mean, I'm just going to say this, and this might be controversial. I'm sorry, but it's just God's honest truth. If we're being really honest, there's a lot of things that white people could just tell everyone to shut up about and be like, well, you're appropriating our culture by doing all of these things. Okay, so I don't know. Like, I don't know. Maybe people should not go down that path. It's, you know what I mean? Because so much of those conversations basically rely on white people just falling back and not saying anything. You know what I mean? That's really what a lot of that stuff relies on. But yeah, I don't really think that it's necessary. And I think I was going to say something that with white people in particular, because again, they tend to be the people who always get attached to these things. The funny thing is that they make the most inclusive media anyway, right? Now, sure, in the efforts to do that, you're going to get it. And anyone who does this, they can be an Asian person, like what we're seeing in the Japanese studios where they're trying to include other cultures or whatever. And then people get mad about it. At the end of the day, I'm sure if I try to include certain other cultures in something I made, someone's going to get annoyed about it, right? It's just what it is. But the reality of the situation is that those people are trying, and sometimes it's going to miss, sometimes it's not. But the fact of the matter is that, like, if the effort's being made, I feel like that's something people should maybe lend a bit more credence to. Maybe that's not to say don't call it out in terms of how it can be improved. But when you're going to attack people or try and like make them feel bad about it, that's what's going to discourage people from bothering. And that's what's going to maybe make people think, maybe I shouldn't do that stuff again. You know what I mean? Or now I don't know how to approach it, because they're in a weird position, because if they're damned if they do and damned if they don't. And I've actually had that opinion for years. When I used to read a lot of these books, in like, YA or whatever, there was an author, is it Veronica Roth, I think, who wrote Divergent? I'm pretty sure it was her. She's made a new sci-fi book series, and straight away people were like mad about it for the same reason, like saying cultural appropriation, yada yada yada, and stuff like that. And I'm not saying whether or not that's accurate because I never read it, but my thing is that, like, she was obviously trying to go out of her way to make an effort to add some representation. And I get it. If it's not good, it's not good. I don't know personally, but let's just say it wasn't good. Cool. But you trying to destroy her for it is not really, like, because at the end of the day, she doesn't have to do that. No matter what people say, the artists do not have to do those things. And I want to be very clear about this as well. If you are an artist and you make stuff, like, don't feel like you have to do these things. I'm sorry. I don't care what anyone says. That's just my opinion. I don't think you should feel obligated to do it. Sorry, I haven't been going on, Anthony. What do you think about that?
I think this kind of brings up a question for me, where having read your book, we actually joked about this in a previous episode, where having read your book and before seeing you face to face, I thought that you were Indian because of the way that certain characters and the main group of women are presented in the book. And so I was going to ask you, do you deliberately think about specific cultures and specific, I would say, national identities when you come up with your writing? Or is that a backseat thing in your mind, maybe just a subconscious thing, or maybe just it's influenced by other media and that's how it ended up being included?
It's more of a media, but like it's a mixture, like especially with like in my story with the Lemuria, which for people who won't know, like Lemuria basically is all female race that live on floating islands. I didn't know about Wonder Woman, okay, so please do not bring up like the all female race on the island. I didn't know. I swear I didn't. But yeah, they were inspired by, similarly to the Amazons that partially, at least the warrior side. There was also, their structure was inspired by Plato's Republic. Literally the class names is based off of the same thing. I just changed the words, but it's the exact same thing. Which is why the people who are at the top, he always had this idea of the philosopher kings, the people who had all the knowledge and all the wisdom. It's the same type of thing in my story. The people at the top are the people who know everything. They see the fate of the world, right? So yeah. And the funny thing is, I don't think reading it, anyone would know that that specific one plays, but I don't think people know that. Even though once I point it out, if you go and look at it, you'll kind of see the similarities. But I don't think people would. It's not like a one-to-one thing. So it's more like a loose sort of inspiration. And I think that's how I mostly do things. I mostly do things more on a like loosely type of basis. And I'm going to say, I'm not sitting there. I'm not George R. R. Martin. Like, yes, I'm a history buff and I love these different cultures. I'm going to make this specific nation like that. And that's not a bad thing necessarily. But that's definitely not my world building style. Which is, proving to be interesting in its own self with my current story where they're going into the East in certain parts now. And I'm thinking up how I want to represent that because it's not all the same. It's different. And whilst I have ideas and I kind of have always got different ideas of how that looks, But it's mostly media, I would say. Like, I would play a game, and again, going back to Japanese, I would play a game like a Final Fantasy, and I would see like some tribal group, and it's like I don't really know if that's based on something or not, but it's in the game and I think it's cool. I don't know. So if someone wants to ask me, like, let's say I took inspiration from like, something in Final Fantasy 7. Let's say I took inspiration from the way how in Final Fantasy 10, like how with Spearar and they've got like the Blitzball, and so, let's just say for some reason I just took inspiration from all of that. And I was just like, this is really cool. And I like these temples. And I like this kind of beach religious, society kind of thing. I'm going to do something like that. Let's say that was actually based on something, which it very well may be. I'm not aware of that. So that's another thing as well, is that you get this almost kind of, it's kind of passed on, sort of thing where they, like one creator will morph a culture as they represent it into their own original work, and then the next person who sees it, they may not even recognize that it came from something else, and then they take it and now they morph it, and then the next person and they morph it, and it just carries on going on and on. Like, for example, the Jedi inspired by Lemuria to a degree, which I feel like is somewhat obvious, but because the Jedi inspired the Lemuria, the Jedi are inspired by the samurai and Buddhism, and you know what I mean. So it's interesting. That one I did know about. But let's say I didn't know. If I didn't know, I would have taken inspiration from them. And then let's say someone didn't know about the Jedi, but they saw my story. They'd be like, oh, those people in there, they remind me of like samurai, blah, blah, blah. You see what I'm saying? So, I think that made sense.
Made sense to me.
Okay, yeah. But what would you say for yourself? Is it, because I was thinking that as well, like, would you say that it's in the forefront of your mind a lot or not?
I mean, it kind of is and it kind of isn't. My deal is I always start with characters. When I develop a storyline, I develop the characters before I even develop the setting and the rest of the world. Like, I figure out this is the type of character I want to write. And once I know the type of character and their journey is when I figure out this is kind of the best genre that I would fit in. Once I know the genre, I know what kind of world I can develop around it. Yeah. And so my thing is I don't want characters overlapping. I have hundreds of characters mapped out because I have so many books planned out. And because I'm trying to make as many of them as unique as possible, I have to resort to different cultures, or else it's just going to turn into I have hundreds upon hundreds of the same white character. Yeah. I already have a joke where it's like, holy crap, maybe I'm into redheads more than I thought I was, because a lot of the female love interests are redheads.
Mara Jade syndrome.
Oh yeah, no, don't get me started on my crush I had on her. That is to this date my biggest complaint about the new canon Star Wars is that I am pissed that they haven't made Mara Jade canon yet.
She might be coming though. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know how that's gonna work, but
I think it's a bit too late now. But
yeah, but I feel like they might do a Thrawn, and it might just be different in. To what it was, but I don't know. Yeah, I feel like that's one. Yeah.
But to kind of finish my answer to your question, the other thing is that, again, I focus so much on characters in my stories that there is world building in my stories. There's setting, there's background stuff, but it's not a huge focus. And so I get to cheat a lot, where I don't need to be super detailed or have an inside knowledge of all the mechanics and workings and beliefs of any specific culture, because I just have to give a broad overview. And so what's funny is that in my fantasy series, in the third book, there's a character that's like, this is an amazing city. I want to get to know more about this culture. I want to get to know more about the people here. I want to explore this place. Another character has to tell them, the world is ending, and if we don't leave right now to stop the antagonist, everything is going to be destroyed. If you survive the journey, you can come back here later and explore.
Yeah.
But that's kind of my approach, and it goes back to, if you're writing a story, know your strengths and weaknesses. I'm not as interested in world building as other people, and so I don't focus on it, and I structure the plot so that I don't have to.
Yep. I'm pretty much similar. I feel like I'm going in a direction where I'm going a bit into it, which I don't mind, but yeah, it's I definitely don't go as too far into it. I'm very, very much more character oriented as well, and care more about like interesting plots and themes and stuff like that. And the setting's really mostly a backdrop, and sometimes it can be interesting and can have some cool stuff to it. But like, for example, in my story, again, like there's certain things I knew for a fact was just going to be taken from history, like the Industrial Revolution to an extent, and the idea of like a Victorian-esque type of society, for at least for one part of the world, because the entire world's not like that. And in fact, that ironically, and I'm not gonna spoil my story too much, but it's teased in the book and it's kind of referenced at certain points. But like, ironically, that specific part of the world that's having the Industrial Revolution, which in the fantasy genre specifically, that's, first of all, that's not usual to see in fantasy. I mean, there's like, there's names for it, Gaslamp fantasy, blah, 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 but typically that genre is not as what people think of with fantasy. So the idea of like electric lights and stuff, not just candlelight, that's not usually in that type of setting. But the funny thing about my setting, and again, this is not going too far with it, is that is one of the least technologically developed parts of the world. Now, the funny thing is, in the first book, it's only kind of alluded to, but in the sequel I'm writing now, and in the future you'll see more. Like they reference in book 1 that there's things like airships and blah blah, like which the very first time I really saw something like that was again in Final Fantasy. So and I used to think, wow, that's so cool, like airships. Like that was actually one of my favorite things that was in Final Fantasy. Like I remember playing Final Fantasy 12 and just thinking, man, this is so cool. And again, like that could come from a culture or something, and someone could get mad and say that that's appropriation and that's not good. But then I appreciated the inclusion of that thing in that game. And and this is another thing as well, is that you got to just kind of ask yourself, like, what exactly is the end goal of that discussion anyway? I mean, okay, like, again, this goes back to what I was saying earlier. Like, even if we say it is that, then what? Is it better to shut people out and close them off from being able to include cultures because you feel like it's, appropriation? Or should they just make these things? And if it's trash, cool, then we're just like, okay, that's not so great. But then, like, should the effort not be made? Because sometimes it's amazing. And also, we just have to be really honest about this, especially when people borrow from dead cultures. J.K. Rowling, at the end of the day, she used like all these Latin terms. Okay, now I don't know. Maybe people from back who in the day who use those words, maybe they'd feel pissed about the fact that she's using those words. But as it currently stands right now, there's not really anyone who's in a position to get mad about it. So, yet I've seen some people still try to get mad about it, but it doesn't. And that's another thing. Like, who's even qualified to get mad? It just it's absurd. I just think it's going to in a direction where, again, a lot of these things, all you're doing is stifling creativity, and you're discouraging people from creating, again, the very diversity that you want to see. So let people make those things. And if it turns out that it's rough or it's whack, sure enough, like, you can tell them. I mean, I can't control people. If you want to be horrible by it, you're going to be horrible by it. And look, sometimes I roast things a lot as well, so it is what it is. I'm not, but I think just try and be a bit more open to people's attempts. You know what I mean? Like, but if I'm going to be completely honest with you, like, for me, when I make something, I'm never going to feel like, oh, I can't do this. Now, that being said, I do try and at least put some measure of effort. Like, if I know I'm blatantly borrowing from something, for example, like the Victorian era, even though there's no one from the Victorian era around anymore, I still just don't want people who know about that era or know about those things to look at it and be like, that's terrible, that's trash, that doesn't make any sense whatsoever. You know, I want, and a big part of that for me is really more to do with like immersion and realism and just feeling like my setting is somewhat alive or realistic. Because like you said, Anthony, and similarly to you, I'm not like the biggest like person who's like obsessed with, you know, the world building and like the structure and the economy and all that stuff. I even when I'm reading other people's stories, that stuff that's not what I'm going to remember. And I don't think that's what most people remember. Most people are going to remember the characters and the plot. That's what the vast majority of people are going to remember. And so, you know, even like if you're watching a movie that seems to be centered around like sports or, you know, gambling or something like that, like a certain activity, it's still ultimately about the characters that are engaging in the activity. It's still about them. That's what's hooking us in, you know. So I think that's always going to be the sure bet. But hey, yeah, that's just my opinion on that. But do you have anything else to say in regards to that specific like thread of conversation, like to do with our own works or just writing things in general, like in terms of culture, or any advice for people, I guess?
No, I think I've said my piece, and I'm 90% sure that I haven't said anything that'll get me canceled. And I am pretty certain I want to keep it that way. So
there's only 10% chance. There's only a 10% chance, right? You know, it's funny. It's funny though, because like I just feel like if someone, yeah, you know, if someone was like, oh, why did you say this stuff on your podcast? It's just like, I don't know, because I can.
Yeah, the 10% is that Disney doesn't disturb my money until they make Mara Jade canon.
Yeah. Uh-oh. Now someone who's a Disney apologist is going to get mad. No, I'm joking. But yeah, I mean, I guess that's pretty much all we've got to say on the topic. I felt like it would be an interesting one to bring up. It's funny because some of these topics, some of these discussions, they're going to, you know, it is a storytelling podcast. Now, with this specific episode, maybe you'd sit there and you'd be like, I don't know. Was this about storytelling? Yes, because storytelling expands beyond just writing works or video games or whatever. It's the stories of life. And yes, we are being that broad with this. But the reality is, whilst we do narrow and zone it in on writing and, you know, the craft of making stories, this is something to think about. Because in this day and age, we have to be realistic about this. There are a subset of people out there who are going to come and evaluate your cultures. And they are going to come and look and see, is this appropriation? And did you do this right? And or not? And there's going to be some people who are going to be mad, no matter what, no matter how well you try and do it. Some people, if you're just not of that culture, they just may not like the fact that you made it. Period. Doesn't even matter if you did it well. And that's just what it is, you know? And I think that's something you got to bear in mind, and you got to accept that some people are just going to dislike it. And you got to decide for yourself how that affects your approach to stories and how you want to do things. You know, like I said, for myself, I will try and put in a certain level of effort with researching, but I'm not doing that because I don't want to get cancelled. I can tell you that right now. That's never in my head. The reason why I do it is because I want to have the immersive aspect of it, and I want something that just feels somewhat realistic. I actually care more about historians or some kind of person looking at it and being like, oh, that's not historically accurate, rather than, oh, it's cultural appropriation. I care more about like it in a more technical sense rather than, oh, it made me feel bad type of sense. If I guess there's some crossover there, but anyway, yeah, I'm pretty much done. You got any final words, Anthony?
Sure. If you don't want to worry about any of this, just stick to the fantasy genre and make up cultures, and you'll at least have a good excuse if people come after you.
Yeah, they're still gonna come after you, by the way, just so you know. But yeah, that's you got the most shielding with that genre for sure. But yeah, that's been the Right Cast episode 7. That's going to be it from us. I have no idea what we're going to talk about in the next episode because sometimes we just decide. But I'm sure it's going to be interesting because that's all we do. And yeah, be on the lookout also for the merchandise because we're sponsored. I'm joking, but not. Well, maybe one day. But anyway, that's all I've got to say. And Anthony, that's all you've got to say, right?
Yep.
All right. Peace, guys.
Ciao.